Get this kid out of my courtroom now. Judge William Whitmore's gavel slammed like a gunshot, his voice cutting through the packed gallery. At the defense table stood a 9-year-old boy in an oversized suit, clutching a battered briefcase that looked bigger than he was. Reporters whispered. Someone laughed. "Look at this kid playing lawyer." The bailiff stomped forward, boots echoing across the marble floor. "Move it, son. You're embarrassing yourself." But Elijah Carter didn't move. He lifted his chin, eyes steady on the furious judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice small but steady, "I invoke Federal Rule 17. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Cameras stopped. The laughter died. The judge's face went pale. Because what that 9-year-old boy said next didn't just shock the courtroom, it exposed a conspiracy that would bring down the most powerful men in Montgomery County. The Riverside apartments looked like something time had forgotten. Cracked windows reflected the dull winter sun. Paint peeled from the walls in jagged flakes, and rusted pipes hissed in the cold wind. A broken sign out front still read, "Luxury living, affordable prices," though no one living there could remember when the place had been anything close to luxury. Inside apartment 4B, the smell of damp plaster and old paper hung in the air like something permanent. 9-year-old Elijah Carter sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by towers of law books stacked unevenly around him. Their covers were torn, their pages yellowed, but to Elijah, they were treasures. He had found them 3 years ago behind the county law library, abandoned volumes waiting for the trash truck. While other kids collected baseball cards, Elijah collected loopholes, court rulings, and forgotten justice. The single lamp in the living room buzzed faintly, throwing a weak cone of light over the boy's concentrated face. His finger traced every line of legal text as if memorizing the shape of justice itself. The radiator was long dead, and the chill of early winter crept in through cracked windows. He didn't seem to notice. From the tiny kitchen, Grace Carter called out, her voice rough from exhaustion. "Eli, dinner's ready, honey." No answer. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaned around the doorframe, and saw him, tiny, serious, a book half his size open on his knees. Her chest ached at the sight. "Baby, you need to eat before the food gets cold." "I'm almost done with this section, Mama," Elijah murmured without looking up. "It's about tenant rights and property maintenance." Grace sighed. The walls were paper-thin, and from next door came the muffled sound of someone arguing in Spanish over the TV. The ceiling above creaked where the Johnson family's kids were running. Life in Riverside was a symphony of noise and survival. She sat beside Elijah, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "You read more than any grown man I know," she said softly. "But even geniuses need food." He looked up, grinning faintly. "I'm not a genius. I just don't like when people get cheated." Grace smiled, though her eyes were tired. At 28, she already carried the weight of someone twice her age. 3 jobs, 1 child, 0 breaks. She had been a foster kid, shuffled between homes that smelled of bleach or booze, told by a dozen adults that she was tough when she really just learned not to cry. Elijah was her miracle, her reason for every early morning and sleepless night. They ate dinner together at a small wobbly table, macaroni, canned corn, and the last piece of chicken split between them. Grace tried not to think about the rent due in 2 days. She'd already sold her winter coat to cover the electric bill. "Did you finish your science homework?" she asked between bites. I finished all my homework last week, Elijah said simply. I wanted more reading, so I went to the library. Grace raised an eyebrow. The public library, or the one behind the courthouse? He smiled, caught. The courthouse one. Elijah, she scolded, half laughing. You can't just sneak in there. They don't stop me anymore, he said with pride. The security guard says I'm quieter than the lawyers. Grace shook her head, laughing despite herself. But later that night, as she watched him scribbling notes across the wall in neat handwriting, legal terms, arrows connecting laws to outcomes, her heart swelled and broke at the same time. Her son was brilliant, but he was still a child, one growing up in a world that didn't care about brilliance if you were poor. The next morning, wind rattled the windows like fists. Grace left before dawn to clean an office building downtown. Elijah woke to the sound of her boots leaving the hallway, then the familiar slam of the apartment door. He poured cereal into a chipped bowl, added powdered milk, and turned on the small radio for company. Temperatures expected to drop below freezing tonight. City shelters at full capacity, the announcer said. Elijah turned the volume down and returned to his books. At 9 years old, he already thought like a lawyer. He read cases about landlords evicting families over minor infractions, about judges dismissing tenant complaints as frivolous. Each story made him angrier, but also sharper. He began keeping a notebook labeled "If I Were a Lawyer." Inside, he wrote arguments, counter-arguments, and snippets of laws he wanted to memorize. By evening, the pipes began groaning again, dripping brown water into the sink. The heater, silent since last winter, stayed cold. Elijah shivered and wrapped himself in a blanket while he studied. When Grace came home past midnight, her hands were cracked from cleaning chemicals. "How was work, Mama?" he asked sleepily. "Same as always," she sighed, setting down her worn purse. "Rich folks make a mess, poor folks clean it up." She kissed his forehead and turned to check the heater again. Still nothing. "I called Mr. Langston's office twice this week," she muttered. "No one answers." Victor Langston, the landlord, owned more than 200 buildings in the county. He was rich enough to have a different car for every day of the week, but none of that money went into repairs. Grace had never even met him, only his men, who collected rent with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. 3 days later, a loud knock rattled the apartment door. Grace opened it to find a man in a suit holding an envelope. "Delivery for Grace Carter," he said flatly. She signed the paper, took the envelope, and froze when she saw the words "eviction notice" printed across the top. Her knees went weak. "Eviction? For what?" The man was already walking away. "You'll have to read the paperwork, ma'am. Court date's in 3 weeks. Elijah rushed to her side. "What is it, Mama?" Grace's hands shook as she tore the papers open. "They're suing us," she whispered. "They're saying we caused $50,000 in damage." Elijah frowned, scanning the document. 50,000? That's impossible." "They have pictures," she said, showing him the photographs attached. Water damage, mold, cracks in the walls. "They're saying we destroyed the place." Elijah studied the photos carefully. The stains, the cracks, the warped floorboards, they looked familiar. "Mama," he said slowly, "don't you still have the pictures from when we moved in?" "Yes, but why?" "Because these look exactly the same." Grace blinked, realization dawning. "You mean they're using old damage against us?" He nodded. "If we prove those photos existed before we moved in, they can't blame us." Grace's face fell. "Eli, we can't afford a lawyer. We can barely afford dinner." And that night, after Grace finally fell asleep on the couch, Elijah stayed up reading. The flicker of the lamp painted shadows across the peeling wallpaper. He dove into case studies about tenant lawsuits and eviction law. That's when he found something that changed everything. Rule 17 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. It allowed someone known as a next friend to represent another person in court if they were incapacitated. Elijah's heart raced. His mother was too sick and overworked to handle this, but what if he could? At dawn, Grace woke to the sound of typing. Elijah was hunched over their old computer, drafting something. "Baby, what are you doing?" "Filing paperwork," he said without looking up. "We have rights, Mama. I just have to show the court." Grace smiled tiredly. "Eli, I love that you want to help, but the world doesn't work that way. They won't listen to a child." He looked at her then, calm, determined. "Then they'll have to learn how." Over the next week, Elijah lived like a man with a mission. He walked to the public library after school, borrowed every book about property law, and studied until the lights went out. Librarians whispered about the little boy who read legal codes like fairy tales. Meanwhile, Grace tried every option she could think of. Legal aid, community centers, churches. All had the same answer: "We're sorry, ma'am. The waiting list is 6 months long." The stress broke her down piece by piece. Meals turned into coffee and crackers. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. One night she dropped a stack of plates while cleaning and burst into tears. Elijah rushed to her side. "Mama, please, don't cry." "I can't fight them, Eli," she whispered. "They've got lawyers, money, judges who don't even look at people like us." "Then we'll make them look," he said. 2 nights later, Grace collapsed at her office cleaning job. Her supervisor found her unconscious near a bucket of disinfectant. At the hospital, Elijah sat in the waiting room, feet dangling off the chair. The doctor explained she was suffering from dehydration, exhaustion, and stress. "She needs rest, son. Real rest." When Grace woke, she saw her boy sitting beside her, reading a legal brief. "Eli," she murmured, her voice weak, "promise me you'll stop worrying about this." "I can't," he said softly. "If we don't fight, they'll take everything. They'll take you." That night, Elijah made his decision. He walked into the Montgomery County Clerk's office the next morning, wearing his father's old jacket that hung past his knees. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed, and a dozen clerks tapped away at keyboards. He stepped up to the counter, cleared his throat, and spoke with the calm confidence of a man twice his age. "Good morning, ma'am. I'd like to file a pro se motion for next friend representation in the case of Carter versus Langston Properties." Mrs. Dolores Finch, the clerk on duty, blinked. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. What did you just say?" "I'm here to file a motion to represent my mother, Grace Carter, as next friend under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 17. The room went quiet. Typing stopped. A man at the back turned his chair to look. Mrs. Finch frowned kindly. "Honey, children can't file legal motions. You need a parent or guardian to—" "With respect, ma'am," Elijah interrupted politely, "there's no statute setting a minimum age for next friend representation in emergency cases. Would you like me to cite the precedent?" The clerk blinked again. "The precedent?" "Yes, ma'am. Whitman v. State, 2014. The court held that competence, not age, determines standing for next friend status." People were staring now. A security guard leaned on his post, grinning. "Kid's got guts," he muttered. Mrs. Finch hesitated, flipping through the motion Elijah handed her. It was typed cleanly, every paragraph numbered, every page signed. "You did this yourself?" "Yes, ma'am. My mother is hospitalized. This lawsuit caused her condition. I'm filing on her behalf until she recovers." Her hands trembled slightly as she stamped the papers. "Court date is next Friday, 9 a.m., Judge Whitmore's courtroom." Elijah smiled politely. "Thank you, ma'am, and thank you for following proper legal procedure." When he left, whispers rippled through the office like wind through grass. A janitor shook his head. "That kid just filed a motion better than half the lawyers in this county." By nightfall, word had spread. The kid lawyer's story reached neighbors, then reporters, then social media. Families from Langston's other properties began showing up at the Carter's door, carrying photos, letters, inspection reports. A woman named Elena Morales arrived first, clutching pictures of a broken staircase. "If you're really fighting him, take these. My son broke his leg last winter. He never fixed the stairs." And then came Anthony Pierce, holding heating complaints signed and dated by Langston's office. "He ignored us all winter. My wife got pneumonia." Grace listened in disbelief as her tiny apartment filled with neighbors. For the first time in years, the building wasn't silent. People were talking, connecting, believing something might change. Elijah collected every piece of evidence, labeling each envelope carefully. That night, Grace stood in the doorway watching her son work. The lamplight fell across his face, highlighting the smudges under his eyes, the determination set in his jaw. "You shouldn't have to do this," she said quietly. He looked up at her, his eyes older than his years. "When they come for your family, Mama, you don't wait for heroes. You become one." The next morning, frost coated the sidewalks as Elijah walked to school, his mind already drafting arguments. In class, while other kids doodled or whispered, he filled his notebook with outlines titled Cross-Examination Strategy and Procedural Defenses. His teacher paused when she saw it, not knowing whether to be impressed or worried. At home, Grace returned from the hospital weaker but hopeful. When she saw the thick folder of evidence on their table, she reached out to touch it. "Baby, you really think they'll listen?" Elijah nodded. "They'll have to. Truth is louder than money." She smiled, pulling him into a hug. "You're too young to talk like that." "Then maybe the world's too old to change," he whispered. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows of the Riverside apartments, carrying with it the faint smell of damp concrete and something else, possibility. For the first time, Grace didn't feel completely powerless. Somewhere deep down she knew that this boy, her boy, might just be the storm that shook the system awake. And in 1 week, in Judge Whitmore's courtroom, the world would find out just how dangerous truth could be when spoken by a child who refused to be ignored. Morning light filtered through the cracked blinds of apartment 4B, painting narrow stripes across the faded carpet. Grace stirred on the couch, her body aching from another sleepless night. The sound of her son humming softly in the kitchen made her open her eyes. Elijah stood on a stool, carefully pouring 2 cups of instant coffee, one for her, one for him. "Good morning, Mama," he said, voice bright despite the gray chill of the room. Grace smiled weakly. "You shouldn't drink coffee, baby. You're 9. He shrugged. "I have a court date. I need to stay awake." For a moment, she wanted to laugh, but the thought of that courtroom made her stomach twist. She still hadn't decided whether she could allow this. A child, her child, standing before a judge who barely saw poor tenants as human beings. It felt like walking into a lion's den. "Eli," she began gently, "maybe we should try talking to Mr. Langston's people again. Maybe they'll agree to let us move without paying all that money." He shook his head. "They don't negotiate, Mama. They intimidate." He set the mug in her hands, meeting her eyes. "That's why they win. Because people get tired and scared." Grace looked at him, the oversized jacket, the careful seriousness, and felt a pang of guilt. He deserved playgrounds and cartoons, not legal briefs. But there was something unshakable in him, something she hadn't seen in adults twice his age. Outside, the building groaned as pipes shuddered to life, spitting brown water. A neighbor shouted down the hall about another leak. Grace sighed, rubbing her temples. "This place is falling apart." Elijah's eyes flicked toward the ceiling. "That's what I'm counting on." He spent the rest of the morning knocking on doors, asking neighbors for permission to photograph their apartments. Most welcomed him inside with curiosity. In one unit, paint peeled off like paper. In another, black mold crawled behind the refrigerator. He documented everything with the old digital camera his teacher had loaned him. When he returned, Grace was sitting at the table staring at a thick envelope that had arrived by certified mail. "It's from Langston's lawyers," she said. Her voice shook slightly as she handed it to him. Elijah slid it open carefully. Inside were 20 pages of dense legal text. He read silently while Grace paced behind him. "They're offering a settlement," he said finally. "If we leave in 7 days and admit fault, they'll drop the $50,000 claim." "Admit fault?" Grace repeated. "But we didn't do anything wrong." "That's why they want you to sign. If you do, you can never sue them for what they did." She sank into the chair, hands covering her face. "Baby, we can't fight people like this. They have teams of lawyers." Elijah looked up, calm but fierce. "Then they should be scared of people like us, because we only need the truth." That night, snow fell outside, thin and dirty, covering the sidewalks in a gray film. Grace tried to sleep, but every creak of the building made her flinch. Around midnight, she got up for water and found Elijah still awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor, papers spread around him like wings. "Eli, it's 2 a.m., she whispered. "I know," he murmured without looking up. "I found something." She stepped closer. The open page before him read Montgomery County Judicial Ethics Disclosure Reports. "Where did you get that?" "Public records," he said. "It's all online if you know where to look." He pointed at a line on the screen. "Judge Whitmore. He owns stock in Langston Properties. That's illegal. He's supposed to recuse himself from any case involving them." Grace froze. "You're saying the judge in our case, he's part of this?" He nodded. "It's not just Langston, it's the whole system." She sat down beside him, feeling the room tilt. "Eli, this is dangerous. These men have power." He looked up at her, eyes shining with something between fear and conviction. "Then we take their power away." The next few days blurred together. Grace returned to work, though every muscle protested. Elijah balanced school and investigation like an adult balancing 2 jobs. He visited the city clerk's office to request more documents, spent afternoons interviewing tenants, and evenings drafting outlines for his argument. One afternoon, a knock echoed through their hallway. When Grace opened the door, she froze. Victor Langston himself stood there, a tall man in a tailored coat, smile sharp as glass. "Mrs. Carter," he said smoothly. "I thought I'd come by personally." I hear there's some confusion about the damages to my property." Grace's stomach twisted. "You shouldn't be here." "Relax," he said, stepping inside without invitation. "I'm here to help. You're a hard-working woman. I respect that. This lawsuit, it's unfortunate. If you sign the settlement, I'll forget the whole thing." "I won't sign anything without legal advice," she said quietly. Langston chuckled. "Legal advice? From who? That little boy of yours?" Elijah stepped out of the bedroom then, holding a folder to his chest. "Mr. Langston," he said evenly, "this conversation should be recorded for court." Langston blinked, then laughed. "You're adorable. Do you even know what recorded for court means?" "It means you just violated tenant privacy laws by entering without notice," Elijah replied. "And any attempt to intimidate us can be considered harassment under state statute 540.003. The landlord's smile faltered. "Watch yourself, kid." Grace stepped between them, trembling but firm. "Get out of my home." Langston's voice hardened. "You think you're clever, but I know every landlord in this city. Cross me, and you'll never rent again." He turned, coat flaring, and slammed the door behind him. Grace collapsed against the wall, shaken. Elijah put a hand on her arm. "Mama, he's scared. That's why he came." "He's dangerous," she whispered. "Then he's exactly the kind of man the law was made to stop." The next morning, Elijah walked to school past news vans parked near the complex. Someone had leaked his story to the local paper. 9-year-old files motion against county's largest landlord. He avoided the reporters, ducking his head, but the whispers followed him all the way to class. At recess, a group of boys cornered him by the fence. "Hey, lawyer boy," one sneered. "You gonna sue us for stepping on your rights?" The others laughed. Elijah said nothing. He'd learned that silence could be louder than shouting. When he got home, the front door was cracked open. Panic shot through him. "Mama," he called. Grace appeared, pale and furious. "They came while I was at work," she said. "Someone broke in. Nothing's missing, but they left the door open." Elijah's eyes darkened. "He's trying to scare us." Grace nodded slowly. "It's working." That night, she couldn't stop pacing. "Baby, maybe we should move. Start over somewhere else." Elijah looked up from his notes. "If we run, he wins. If we stay, we make history." She stared at him, so small, so certain. "Where did you even learn to talk like that?" He smiled faintly. "From you." 3 days before the hearing, the apartment was filled with people. Tenants brought boxes of old complaints, inspection reports, photos of leaks and broken heaters. Elijah cataloged everything, building what he called the case that breaks the chain. Mrs. Morales squeezed his shoulder. "You remind me of my brother," she said softly. "He used to talk about justice, too, before the system broke him." Elijah met her eyes. "Then we'll fix it." Grace watched from the kitchen, pride and fear twisting together. She whispered to herself, "Please, God, protect him from what he's walking into." That evening, she found him sitting on the floor, papers scattered around like fallen snow. He was staring blankly at the wall. "Eli," she said gently. He blinked. "I was thinking, what if I lose?" She knelt beside him. "Then you'll still be the bravest person I know." He looked at her, tears glinting. "I don't want to be brave, Mama. I just want you safe." She pulled him into her arms, whispering into his hair, "You already made me safe, baby. You made me believe again." The next day, the courthouse loomed ahead. Gray stone, tall columns, flags snapping in the wind. Elijah's shoes squeaked on the polished floor as they entered. People stared, some smiling, some whispering, "That's the kid." In the hallway outside courtroom 3B, a reporter crouched to his level. "Elijah, are you nervous?" He straightened his jacket. "Nervous people don't change things." Grace squeezed his hand, her palm trembling. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," he said softly, "because nobody else will." Inside, Judge Whitmore's nameplate gleamed beneath the courtroom lights. The man himself sat behind the bench, expression carved from stone. Across the aisle, Victor Langston whispered with his attorney Mark Caldwell, both confident, both smirking. When the bailiff called the case, Langston Properties versus Carter Family, the room filled with murmurs. A child standing at the defense table was not something Montgomery County had ever seen. Judge Whitmore peered over his glasses. "Is this a joke?" Elijah's voice didn't waver. "No, Your Honor. I'm here under Federal Rule 17 to represent my mother, Grace Carter, who is temporarily incapacitated due to stress-related illness." The judge scowled. "Children don't practice law in my courtroom." "With respect, sir," Elijah said, "there's no rule against it." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Langston chuckled. Caldwell smirked. But Judge Whitmore hesitated. There was something unnervingly precise about the boy's tone. "Proceed," the judge said at last, his voice sharp. "But you're on thin ice." Grace held silently beside her son, hands clasped tight. Elijah adjusted his papers, ready to present his opening statement. But before he could speak, Langston's attorney stood. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss. This proceeding is a circus. Allowing a child to argue law undermines the entire judicial process." Elijah turned toward him, calm as glass. "Mr. Caldwell, are you familiar with Williams v. Montgomery County, 2009? The court ruled that next friend representation requires only competent advocacy, not bar certification." The attorney blinked, speechless. The boy continued. "If you'd like, I can provide the page citation." A ripple of laughter ran through the crowd, this time not at Elijah, but at the man twice his height who had just been silenced by a 9-year-old. Judge Whitmore rapped his gavel. "Order." Langston glared across the aisle. "You think this is funny?" Elijah met his gaze. "No, sir, but justice usually starts with someone not laughing anymore." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as recess was called, microphones thrust toward Grace and her son. "Mrs. Carter, how does it feel watching your boy stand up to the system?" She smiled through trembling lips. "Feels like watching history." Back inside, in a quiet hallway, Victor Langston cornered Elijah near the water fountain. His voice was low, dangerous. "Listen, kid. You don't understand what you're messing with. People who cross me regret it." Elijah looked up, unflinching. "Are you threatening a witness, Mr. Langston? Because that's obstruction of justice." Before Langston could answer, Grace appeared, fury flashing in her eyes. "Step away from my son." Cameras clicked. A crowd gathered. Langston stepped back, forcing a smile for the press, but in his eyes, Elijah saw fear. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was electric. The next words Elijah would speak could shake the entire county. Grace leaned close, whispering, "Baby, are you ready?" He nodded. "Ready, Mama. Let's finish what we started." And as Judge Whitmore raised his gavel to reconvene the session, every person in that room understood that the balance of power had just shifted, from the men who ruled the system to the boy who dared to challenge it. The echo of the gavel still rang in Elijah's ears when the courtroom fell silent again. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, face stern but visibly unsettled. Around them, the packed gallery was alive with energy. Whispers, hurried notes from reporters, the hum of cameras trying to capture every twitch of this strange, historic trial. Across the aisle, Victor Langston sat stiffly beside his lead attorney, Mark Caldwell, who was flipping through papers as if the right document might make the 9-year-old vanish. Langston's jaw was tight, his eyes dark with irritation. "Proceed," said Judge Whitmore, voice thin. "Let's see if the boy can keep this circus under control." Elijah took a breath. He stood, buttoned his oversized jacket, and approached the evidence table. His small hands trembled, not from fear, but from the electricity of knowing this was real. Everything he had studied, every late-night whisper to his mother, every injustice he'd seen in the building's broken walls, it had all led here. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear, "Langston Properties claims my mother, Grace Carter, caused $50,000 in damages to apartment 4B of Riverside Apartments. They presented photographs as evidence. I will show that those photographs document pre-existing conditions, ones Mr. Langston knew about before we ever moved in." He lifted a photo with a yellowed timestamp in the corner. "This image shows water damage in our bathroom. Here's another, taken by my mother on move-in day, 2 years earlier. Same stain, same shape, same ceiling." Caldwell rose immediately. "Objection. Those photos could have been manipulated. They're not verified evidence." Elijah turned to him calmly. "Then you'll be happy to know, sir, they were emailed to the city's health department the same week we moved in. They exist in government archives." A ripple of murmurs ran through the room. Caldwell frowned, flipping through his notes in frustration. Grace watched her son from the table, her hands gripping her knees so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to cry, from pride, from fear, from everything at once. Elijah continued, walking slowly toward the judge. "We also reported broken heaters and spreading mold to Langston Properties. We filed complaints all ignored. Under the implied warranty of habitability, which is federal law, Your Honor, landlords must maintain safe living conditions. Mr. Langston violated that repeatedly." He paused, letting the silence settle. "This case isn't about one broken apartment. It's about a pattern, a system where people like us are punished for being poor." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge shifted uncomfortably. "Stick to the facts, young man." "Yes, Your Honor," Elijah said. "The facts are exactly what I'm presenting." He reached for another file labeled Building C Complaints. "This," he said, opening it, "belongs to Mr. Anthony Pierce. He and his family lived in another Langston property. The heating system failed last winter. They reported it 3 times. His wife developed pneumonia. Instead of fixing the heat, Mr. Langston's office sent them an eviction notice for neglecting to maintain the unit." Langston's attorney tried to interrupt again, but Elijah didn't stop. "And this," he continued, holding up another document, "is from Mrs. Elena Morales. Same landlord, same excuses. Her son broke his leg because the stairs collapsed. They were never repaired. She was later sued for structural damage." Judge Whitmore frowned. "How did you obtain these records?" "Public filings," Elijah said evenly. "All legal, all ignored. until today." The judge stared at the boy, trying to find some crack in the armor of his logic. But Elijah stood steady, every movement deliberate. Langston whispered furiously to Caldwell. The lawyer rose again. "Your Honor, these anecdotes are irrelevant to the specific case of the Carters. This boy is grandstanding." Elijah turned his gaze on him. "If I may respond." The judge nodded reluctantly. "Pattern evidence isn't grandstanding, sir. It's precedent. When a landlord repeats the same violation across multiple properties, it proves intent, not accident." Even Caldwell didn't have an immediate comeback for that. The tension in the room grew heavier. Grace sat frozen, watching her son navigate legal combat like a seasoned attorney. A soft voice from behind whispered, "That kid's a prodigy." Finally, Judge Whitmore rapped his gavel. "Enough. Recess for 30 minutes. Court resumes at 2. Elijah returned to the defense table, sinking into his chair. The moment he sat, Grace leaned over, cupping his face in her trembling hands. "Baby, you were incredible." He smiled faintly. "We're not done yet." In the hallway, the noise was deafening. Reporters surrounded them instantly. Flashbulbs popped. "Elijah, where did you learn to argue law?" one asked. "Who's helping you?" shouted another. "Nobody," Elijah said simply. "The law belongs to everyone. I just decided to read it." Grace placed a protective hand on his shoulder. Cameras swarmed closer until courthouse security had to clear a path. But even through the chaos, Elijah's mind was still working, calculating, connecting, remembering. At the far end of the hall, Victor Langston stood watching, his expression no longer smug. He looked angry. No, threatened. When their eyes met, Elijah saw it clearly. Fear. Langston leaned toward Caldwell. "We need to shut this down. The kid's too dangerous." Caldwell rubbed his forehead. "He's a child. The court won't take him seriously." "Then why are there cameras outside?" Langston snapped. Back in the empty courtroom, Judge Whitmore sat alone at the bench, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I know it looks bad," he hissed quietly. "The boy's pulling public sympathy. We might need to postpone." His voice dropped lower. "No, Victor, you can't call the DA. That'll make it worse. Let me handle it." He hung up quickly when he heard footsteps. Elijah had returned, carrying a thin folder. He approached the bench respectfully. "Your Honor, may I file an additional motion before we resume?" Whitmore frowned. "You're not supposed to approach without counsel present." "With respect, sir," Elijah said, "I am the counsel." He handed over the folder. The judge glanced at it, his name printed neatly across the front. "What's this?" "Financial disclosure documents, Your Honor. They show that you hold stock in Langston Properties. That's a conflict of interest under Canon 3 of the Judicial Code of Conduct." Whitmore froze. "Where did you get this?" "It's public record," Elijah said softly, "but you didn't disclose it." For a moment, there was no sound. The boy and the judge stared at each other across the empty courtroom, power and innocence locked in a silent duel. Then Elijah turned and walked back to his table. When court resumed, the air felt different. Judge Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. His voice cracked on the first word. Caldwell began his closing argument for the day, trying to distract from the growing storm. He painted Grace as negligent, careless, ungrateful. "My client provides affordable housing to hundreds of families," he declared, "but some tenants take advantage of his generosity." When he finished, Elijah stood again. "Your Honor, Generosity doesn't require legal threats, it requires maintenance. He opened a new set of papers, copies of inspection reports he had found 3 nights earlier. These city inspections are dated 3 months before we moved into apartment 4B. Every single issue in Mr. Langston's complaint was already listed. Water damage, cracked walls, black mold. He laid the documents on the table. Mr. Langston's company signed these reports. His signature is right here. The crowd erupted in whispers. Judge Whitmore's gavel struck wood. Quiet! Elijah turned to Langston. So, sir, either these reports are fake, which would be fraud against the city, or they're real, which means you knowingly rented unsafe housing and sued my mother for your own negligence. Which is it? Langston's face turned red. You little brat! Answer the question, Elijah said firmly. Caldwell jumped in. Objection! This is badgering. Overruled, Judge Whitmore muttered weakly, his composure slipping. Langston clenched his jaw. Those reports were preliminary. The repairs were completed. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Then why does the same mold spot appear in your photos 2 years later? Did the repairs include photographing evidence for later lawsuits? The gallery gasped. Someone whispered, "He's destroying him." Langston tried to speak, but words failed. Caldwell leaned in, whispering furiously, "Stop talking." Elijah turned to the judge. Your Honor, I move that these inspection reports be entered into evidence. They prove a pattern of fraud and show that Mr. Langston's claims are not only false, but malicious. The judge hesitated, wiping sweat from his brow. Motion granted. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. The story was spreading in real time. The boy who beat the system. By late afternoon, court adjourned. Grace and Elijah stepped outside to a sea of flashing lights. A young journalist pushed forward, microphone shaking. Elijah, how does it feel to stand up to one of the most powerful landlords in the county? He paused, looking straight into the camera. It's not about power, he said. It's about fairness. My mama taught me that right is right, even when it's hard. And that clip would air on every local station before the night was over. As they walked home through fallen snow, Grace slipped her arm around her son. You scared him, you know, she said softly. Elijah smiled faintly. Then we're getting close to the truth. But the closer they got, the darker things became. 2 nights later, Elijah was at the law library, cross-referencing judicial ethics cases. The security guard, an older man named Reggie, handed him a soda. You sure you're supposed to be in here this late, little man? Elijah smiled. Just until I finish this chapter, Reggie chuckled. You talk like you're 40. Hours passed. The library was silent except for the hum of computers. Elijah's finger traced lines across a document. Financial disclosure reports, legal ethics statements. Then his eyes caught something new. A listing for Whitmore, William, retirement investment portfolio. His breath caught. The file listed Langston Properties, preferred shares, 500 units. He sat back, pulse hammering. He owns the company, he whispered. That was it. The final piece. The judge ruling their case wasn't just biased, he was invested. Every eviction, every judgment in Langston's favor made him richer. He printed the documents carefully, tucking them into his briefcase. Then he checked his notes one more time. Every law, every precedent, every detail burned into his photographic memory. He didn't realize dawn was already breaking. When he returned home, Grace was asleep at the kitchen table, head resting on her arms beside unpaid bills. Elijah covered her with a blanket and whispered, "Almost done, Mama. Just one more day." The next morning, the courthouse steps were swarming with reporters. Signs flashed: "Justice for the tenants," "Believe the boy," "End corruption." Inside, the atmosphere felt charged, ready to explode. Grace squeezed Elijah's hand. "Whatever happens, I'm proud of you," he smiled. "We're going to win, Mama. Not just for us, for everyone." When Judge Whitmore entered, he looked pale, almost sick. He banged the gavel once, voice cracking. "Proceed." Elijah stood slowly. "Before continuing, Your Honor, I must address a serious issue. You are in violation of judicial ethics and cannot continue to preside over this case." A gasp swept the room. Whitmore's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" Elijah opened his folder and began reading. "Public records confirm that you own 500 shares of Langston Properties and that your country club dues are paid by the Montgomery County Landlords Association, chaired by Mr. Langston himself." The judge went silent. Langston's lawyers stared, speechless. The entire courtroom erupted in chaos. "Young man," the judge stammered, "these are outrageous accusations." "They're not accusations," Elijah said. "They're facts." He placed the documents on the bench. "I move for your recusal under Canon 3 of the Judicial Code." Caldwell tried to speak, but the noise drowned him out. Reporters scribbled furiously. Whitmore's hands shook. Finally, he slammed the gavel. "Recess now." As he stormed out, the gallery erupted in shouts and applause. Grace turned to her son, tears glistening. "You did it, baby." Elijah nodded slowly. "Not yet, Mama. We just knocked down the first wall." Outside, news networks broadcast the story live. By nightfall, the state announced a new judge would take over the case. Judge Naomi Reeves, known for her honesty and zero tolerance for corruption. The war had changed sides, and as Elijah stood under the courthouse lights, cameras flashing around him, he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow we show them everything." Snow drifted lazily outside the tall windows of the Montgomery County Courthouse as dawn broke over the city. By the time the first light touched the courthouse steps, the crowd had already gathered. Tenants, activists, reporters, and curious onlookers bundled in scarves and hope. Signs bobbed in the cold wind: "Justice for the Carters," "End landlord corruption," "The boy who fights back." Inside, the air thrummed with anticipation. Courtroom 3B looked less like a local housing court and more like a stage for history. Cameramen lined the back wall. Microphones peeked over the benches. Every seat was filled, every corridor buzzing. The boy at the center of it all sat quietly at the defense table, small hands resting on a stack of papers. Elijah Carter looked calm, but his heart was beating hard enough to shake the world. Beside him, Grace Carter smoothed the sleeves of his oversized jacket, her touch trembling. "You sure about this, baby?" she whispered. Elijah looked up, his brown eyes steady. "They took too much from too many, Mama. It ends today." The door behind the bench opened. Judge Naomi Reeves entered. She was in her early 60s, sharp-eyed, known across the state for cleaning up corrupted courts and dismantling the networks of men who thought power made them untouchable. As she sat, silence fell like a curtain. "Good morning," she said, voice strong and clear. "This court acknowledges a reassignment from Judge Whitmore following a conflict of interest discovery. Effective immediately, I, Judge Naomi Reeves, preside over Carter V. Langston Properties. We will proceed." A murmur rippled through the audience. Reeves glanced toward Elijah. "Mr. Carter, young Mr. Carter, are you prepared to continue?" Elijah rose. "Yes, Your Honor, and thank you for allowing us to be heard." On the opposite side, Victor Langston shifted in his chair. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced with nervous agitation. His attorney, Mark Caldwell, leaned close and whispered, "Keep your composure. Don't engage." But Langston's eyes flicked toward the cameras, toward the boy, and anger boiled in him like acid. Judge Reeves nodded. "Proceed with your opening argument, Mr. Carter." Elijah walked to the center of the courtroom. His steps were slow, deliberate. The wooden floor creaked faintly under his small shoes. He stopped in front of the jury box. Though this was a bench trial, every spectator in that room had already become a silent jury. "My name is Elijah Carter," he began. "I'm 9 years old. My mother and I live, or used to live, in the Riverside Apartments, owned by Langston Properties. For years, Mr. Langston has used the courts not to seek justice, but to destroy families. He sues poor tenants for problems he created, forces them out, ruins their credit, and makes sure they can't fight back." His voice strengthened with every word. "Today isn't about rent. It's about responsibility. It's about whether people with power can rewrite the truth just because they can afford to." Judge Reeves regarded him closely, chin resting on one hand. "Go on." Elijah turned to the projection screen set up beside him. A series of photographs appeared. Cracked walls, mold-covered ceilings, broken heaters. "These are homes owned by Langston Properties," he said. "These are the same conditions that made children sick, that froze families in winter, that pushed mothers like mine to collapse from exhaustion." Grace covered her mouth, eyes glistening. Elijah clicked to the next image, a scan of the inspection reports he had uncovered. "And these," he continued, "are the official inspection documents signed by Mr. Langston's own property managers 3 months before my family moved in. They prove he knew every single problem in that apartment before we ever touched a key." Caldwell shot up from his chair. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant to damages claimed in this particular—" "Overruled," Judge Reeves said smoothly. "The defense will continue." Langston's jaw clenched. His knuckles were white against the armrest. Elijah stepped closer to the witness stand. "Mr. Langston, would you take the stand, please?" Caldwell turned. "Your Honor, my client declines," Judge Reeves interrupted. "He's the plaintiff, Mr. Caldwell. He filed the complaint. He'll testify." Langston rose reluctantly, his expensive shoes clicking across the floor. He sat under oath, looking down at the small figure approaching him. Elijah's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Mr. Langston, you filed a lawsuit claiming my mother caused $50,000 in damages to apartment 4B. Is that correct?" "Yes," Langston said tightly. "And you signed those documents yourself?" "Yes." "And these inspection reports, dated before my family moved in, carry your company's letterhead and the same signatures." Langston hesitated. "I'd have to verify." "Are they forged?" Elijah interrupted. "Because if they are, that's a crime. And if they're not, you knowingly rented unsafe property and lied under oath." The room exploded in murmurs. Grace covered her mouth again, tears spilling silently. Langston swallowed hard. The maintenance team must have missed repairs. "So the same maintenance team forgot to fix 200 apartments?" Elijah asked softly. "Or was it easier to blame the tenants instead of spending the money?" Caldwell stood. "Your Honor, this is harassment." Judge Reeves's gavel cracked. "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell. The witness will answer." Langston's composure crumbled. "You don't understand, kid. This is how the business works. People sign leases. Things break. Business?" Elijah cut in. "You call destroying families business?" His small hand trembled, but his voice rose, stronger than any man in the room. "You sued my mother while she was cleaning floors at midnight to keep us alive. You sent threats to people who couldn't afford lawyers. You made children homeless and called it business." And the gallery erupted in applause before the bailiff shouted for order. Langston's face was red now, eyes wild. Elijah walked slowly back to his table. "No further questions," he said quietly. Judge Reeves exhaled slowly. "You may step down, Mr. Langston." As Langston stumbled back to his seat, the weight of the evidence seemed to settle like a storm cloud over his empire. Then Elijah turned to the judge again. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit additional evidence. Communications between Langston Properties and the Montgomery County Landlords Association. They show payments made toward Judge Whitmore's country club membership." The room gasped. Reeves's expression darkened. "Enter them into record," she said. Elijah placed the folder on the clerk's desk and looked up. "This system was never about justice. It was a business partnership between landlords who profit from suffering and judges who close their eyes." Langston's lawyers looked defeated. Caldwell sat motionless, his face pale. Grace watched her son with awe and disbelief, whispering a prayer she hadn't dared to speak in years. Judge Reeves adjusted her glasses. "The court will take a brief recess before delivering judgment." As soon as the gavel fell, the room exploded into sound. Reporters rushed for the door. Cameramen shouted into microphones. "The boy lawyer just exposed a county-wide scandal." In the hallway, Grace knelt in front of her son, gripping his shoulders. "You did it, baby. You really did it." He shook his head. "Not yet. We still need justice, not just truth." At the far end of the corridor, Victor Langston stood surrounded by flashing cameras. His voice was a hiss through clenched teeth. "You think this is over? I have lawyers in every state." Elijah looked straight at him. "Maybe, but you don't have the truth anymore." When court resumed, the crowd was thicker. Even courthouse staff, who weren't assigned to the case, pressed into the back rows to witness what everyone knew was coming. Judge Reeves began slowly, her voice resonant. "Mr. Langston, the evidence presented today reveals not merely negligence but systematic fraud. You profited from unsafe housing, falsified repair claims, and filed dozens of malicious lawsuits. This court refers your case to the district attorney for criminal investigation." A gasp went up. Langston went white. Reeves turned to Grace. "Mrs. Carter, you and your son have endured injustice that no citizen should face. The court finds in your favor on all counts. You are awarded punitive damages in the amount of $500,000. Grace's breath caught. She covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Elijah reached for her hand. "We won, Mama," he whispered. But Reeves wasn't finished. She turned back to Langston. "You will issue a public apology to the Carters in this courtroom right now." Langston blinked. "What?" "You heard me," Reeves said, eyes narrowing. "Stand up." Slowly, Victor Langston rose, every movement mechanical, his pride dissolving in front of hundreds of witnesses. His voice shook. I apologize to Grace Carter and her son, Elijah Carter, for the false accusations and hardship my actions caused." The gallery erupted. Some clapped, some cried. cameras flashed like lightning. Elijah looked up at him, the man who had tried to destroy them, and said quietly, "Thank you, sir. I hope you remember this feeling the next time you see someone who can't fight back." Judge Reeves nodded once. Court is adjourned. The sound that followed wasn't just applause, it was a roar. The sound of victory, of relief, of centuries of silence cracking open. Reporters surged forward, microphones rising like spears of light. "Eli, how does it feel to beat the system?" someone shouted. He smiled faintly, clutching his worn briefcase. "You don't beat the system," he said. "You remind it what it's supposed to be." That clip went viral within hours. By nightfall, national networks aired the story. The headline read, "The Boy Who Put a Judge on Trial." The next morning, Montgomery County woke to a new reality. Judge Whitmore resigned under pressure, facing federal ethics charges. Langston Properties accounts were frozen pending investigation. Families who'd been evicted began contacting lawyers, their courage rekindled by a 9-year-old with a borrowed suit and a mother who never stopped believing. At home, the Riverside apartment felt different. Sunlight streamed through cracked windows as if even the lot was freer. Grace stood in the kitchen, reading a letter from the courthouse. Payment of judgment confirmed. $500,000. Enough to start over. Enough to breathe. Elijah sat at the same table where it had all begun, tracing the edges of an old photo of their first day in that apartment. "We did it, Mama." Grace smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You did it, baby. You fought for every family in this building." He looked up. "Not just this building." That afternoon, the mayor's office called. Then came reporters from New York, invitations to speak on television, letters from law schools and advocacy groups. But Elijah didn't seem dazzled. He just asked one thing. "Can I visit the families who helped us?" So Grace and Elijah walked through the same cracked hallways where it had all started. Doors opened, faces appeared, neighbors who had once whispered in fear now smiling with pride. Mrs. Morales hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Because of you, they're fixing my stairs," she said. Mr. Pierce held up a repair notice from the city, grinning like a man reborn. The boy who had fought for them blushed and said only, "You deserve better, all of you." And that night, as snow fell over Montgomery County, Grace watched her son asleep on the couch, law books piled beside him. The flickering light from the old lamp glowed softly over his face. She whispered, "You're my miracle, baby." And across the city, in penthouses and offices once ruled by arrogance, powerful men whispered a different truth. One small boy had changed everything. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from the top down. It rises, stubborn and bright, from a cold apartment with broken windows and a child who refuses to accept the world as it is. By spring, the frost on Montgomery County's courthouse lawn had melted into soft puddles, and the headlines had traveled far beyond state lines. 9-year-old dismantles landlord empire. Child lawyer exposes judicial corruption. The story appeared on morning talk shows, legal journals, and even late-night comedy monologues. But inside apartment 4B, the same one that had once leaked, molded, and frozen, the silence felt new. It wasn't fear anymore. It was peace. Elijah sat by the window, legs crossed, writing in a spiral notebook titled The People's Law. The pages were covered in his careful handwriting, notes for the tenants who still came knocking on their door, asking how to file complaints, how to photograph evidence, how to stand up for themselves. His mother, Grace, brewed coffee on a brand new stove, one she'd paid for without flinching. She glanced at him over her shoulder, smiling softly. "Baby, you ever think about what comes next?" Elijah looked up from his notes. "Next? We keep going. Most folks your age are thinking about summer camp," she said. He grinned. "Camp sounds boring compared to court." Grace laughed, shaking her head. "You scare me sometimes, you know that?" "You used to tell me the law was supposed to protect people," he replied. "I just want to make sure it remembers." Across town, the ripple effect of the Carter case was turning into a tidal wave. Judge William Whitmore, the man who once mocked Elijah, was under federal investigation for corruption, ethics violations, and conspiracy. Cameras followed him leaving the courthouse in disgrace. When reporters asked if he had anything to say, he muttered, "The boy knew the rules better than I did." Victor Langston's empire collapsed like rotten scaffolding. The district attorney charged him with fraud, falsifying documents, and perjury. Bank accounts were frozen, properties seized. News clips showed him being escorted out of his glass-walled office, head lowered, handcuffed. When Elijah saw the footage that night, he didn't cheer. He just whispered, "It's over." Grace turned off the TV. "No, baby, it's starting." Within months, Judge Naomi Reeves launched a county-wide reform initiative. Every eviction case from the past 5 years was reopened for review. Tenants who'd been silenced finally had a chance to speak. Legal clinics began springing up in church basements and community centers. And in the middle of it all stood a tiny nonprofit with a handwritten sign taped to the wall: the Carter Family Legal Advocacy Center. Grace ran the office, answering phones and making coffee for volunteers. Elijah, now known nationwide as the kid who rewrote justice, spent his weekends there explaining to bewildered adults how to fill out forms. He never bragged, never acted like a celebrity. He just taught. One afternoon, a reporter from the Washington Ledger visited. Her recorder clicked softly as she asked, "Elijah, do you think you're a hero?" He looked up from a pile of folders. "I think I did what anyone should do if they know something's wrong." "You're 9. He smiled. "Wrong doesn't wait for birthdays." When the article ran, donations poured in. $10 bills from single mothers, checks from retired teachers, envelopes filled with coins and handwritten notes. "Thank you for fighting for us." By summer, the Advocacy Center had helped 72 families win back deposits, secure safe housing, or reopen fraudulent eviction cases. Grace sometimes stared at the corkboard on the office wall where Elijah pinned every thank you letter. She'd trace the words with her fingertips, half afraid she might wake up and find it was all a dream. But the world outside kept proving it was real. Langston's old buildings were purchased by the county and converted into tenant-owned cooperatives, families paying into their own homes for the first time. Mrs. Elena Morales's repaired staircase gleamed with new wood. Mr. Anthony Pierce's heater rattled to life after 2 winters of silence. Elderly residents who'd been evicted returned with city assistance. The news called it the Carter Reform Wave. When the governor signed a new state law protecting tenants from retaliatory lawsuits, she said into the cameras, "This legislation was inspired by a child who reminded us that justice belongs to everyone." That night, Grace and Elijah sat on the rooftop of their newly renovated building, watching the city lights shimmer. "You changed things, Eli," she whispered. He shook his head. "We did. You cleaned floors for strangers so I could read those books. That was the first fight." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You ever wish your daddy could see this?" He smiled sadly. I think he does. Years passed, and the boy who once stood trembling before a corrupt judge grew into a young man walking across the marble floors of Harvard Law School. At 16, Elijah Carter became the youngest student ever accepted. Professors whispered about his case as legend. Students quoted his opening statement in ethics debates. Yet, in his dorm room, his mother's framed photo still sat beside his desk, next to a battered briefcase, the same one he carried into Judge Whitmore's courtroom. Grace visited Boston the first winter he was there. She wrapped him in her arms at the train station, still calling him my baby, even as his shoulders had grown broader. He laughed. "Ma, I'm in law school. You can't call me that here." "Then you better pass every class," she teased, "because I'm still the boss." Back in Montgomery County, the Advocacy Center had blossomed into a network. Former tenants became staff. High school students interned there every summer. On the wall hung a photograph of Elijah at 9 years old, standing in front of the courthouse with the caption, "Right is right, even when you're small." 5 years after the trial, a gray-haired Grace watched her son step onto a stage at the state capitol to receive the National Civic Courage Award. The governor smiled beside him. Cameras flashed. Elijah adjusted the microphone, looking out at the crowd. "When I was a kid," he began, "a judge told me I didn't belong in his courtroom. He was wrong. Every one of you belongs in those rooms where decisions are made about your lives. The law isn't written in marble, it's written in people's hearts. And every time you stand up for someone who can't, you're practicing it." The applause thundered like a storm. After the ceremony, a group of children approached him, some carrying notebooks, others holding printed articles with his photo. A little girl with braids looked up shyly. "Mr. Carter, can kids really be lawyers?" He knelt so their eyes met. "You can be anything that tells the truth loud enough." That line went viral, played over montage clips of Elijah shaking hands with families, walking through the neighborhoods he once called home. His name became shorthand for courage, but he never let it make him proud. When interviewers asked what winning meant, he always said the same thing. The victory wasn't in the verdict. It was in showing people they could fight. In time, Montgomery County became a case study in reform. Other cities copied its programs. Law schools added a new course titled Carter v. Langston, Youth and Ethical Justice. Professors quoted his cross-examination of Langston as an example of moral clarity under pressure. Late one night, after a long day of study, Elijah returned to his dorm room. He sat by the window overlooking the Charles River, rain streaking the glass. He opened a letter that had arrived earlier that day. The envelope was old, addressed in a shaky hand. "Dear Mr. Carter, I was one of the tenants you never met. When you won your case, they canceled the eviction notice on my door. My daughter's asthma got better once they fixed the mold. She's applying to college now to study law. Thank you for giving her that chance." Elijah folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his briefcase. He whispered, "That's why." Back home, Grace was locking up the Advocacy Center for the night when the phone rang. It was the national news channel requesting another interview with her son. She smiled and said, "He'll call you back after exams. Justice has homework too." That weekend, Elijah came home for a visit. The building gleamed with fresh paint and repaired railings. Children played in the courtyard where he once photographed evidence of decay. When he stepped inside apartment 4B, the same apartment that had once been their prison, Grace had redecorated it, not lavishly, just enough to feel alive. He sat at the kitchen table where it all began. The law books were still there, neatly stacked, a relic of their old war. Grace poured 2 cups of coffee, sat down opposite him, and asked softly, "You happy?" He thought for a long moment. "I'm not finished yet." "Still fighting the world?" "Still fixing it," he said. She smiled. "Then the world's in good hands." That night they walked to the courthouse together. It was empty, quiet under the moonlight. Elijah stopped at the steps where he'd once stood shaken with fear, clutching a too big briefcase. Grace slipped her arm through his. "You ready for whatever's next?" she asked. He looked at the tall stone building, the carved words above the door, "Equal justice under law," and smiled. "I was born ready." A breeze stirred the flags overhead. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed midnight. The boy, who had once been laughed at for believing in justice, had grown into a man determined to make it real. His story had become a reminder whispered in courtrooms, classrooms, and quiet kitchens across America. That truth, when spoken bravely, doesn't need permission. That courage isn't measured in years, but in conviction. That even a child, standing alone, can make the world listen. And if you were to pass the Montgomery County Courthouse today, you'd find a bronze plaque near the entrance bearing those same words Elijah spoke to Judge Whitmore the day the laughter stopped. "Your Honor, I invoke Federal Rule 17. Underneath, in smaller letters, "Dedicated to Elijah and Grace Carter, whose fight for justice reminded the world that right is right, no matter how small the voice." As the sun rises over the courthouse steps, it gleams across those words, across the city that learned to listen. And somewhere, perhaps in another broken apartment, another child reads a book and dares to believe that the law, like hope, belongs to everyone.